These video notes start up with part 2 of 9.1. And where we left off in part 1, it was talking about glycolysis as always being the first step in cellular respiration. And remember, from glycolysis, we start off with glucose. It needs a little bit of starter ATP to ATP to kind of break down the different carbons. We have NAD plus being turned into NADH. We have a release of 4-ATP, giving us this 2-pyruvic acid. Well, there can be 2 different pathways that happen after glycolysis, and it's dependent upon whether or not there is oxygen. So fermentation is one of these pathways, and it happens when there is a lack of oxygen, and we would call this anaerobic. And think of without aerobic, oxygen, air type of thing. So what happens is in order for this cycle to continue and glycolysis can be able to happen, you need to have this NAD plus. And what happens is without the oxygen, we don't get a recycling of those. So you end up not having kind of what you need in order to start glycolysis. So if you don't have that, and we'll talk about where that plays a role in the next section, but if you don't have that, it's going to lead into fermentation where the different organisms are going to try and replenish that supply so glycolysis can start again. So in the absence of oxygen, ATP may still be produced via a process called fermentation. So fermentation will derive energy from organic compounds like carbohydrates, sugars, glucose, in the absence of oxygen. So what you have to know about fermentation is we have this lack of oxygen. Cellular respiration always begins with glycolysis, and the presence or absence of oxygen will then determine whether cellular respiration or fermentation will follow. So with oxygen, you're going to have cellular respiration. Without, fermentation. So there's 2 different types of fermentation based on the organism, the cells that are involved in it. So we, again, remember back to glycolysis, we get the formation of 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules from your 6-carbon glucose molecule. There's a releasing of 2 ATP molecules, and this is your net gain. Remember, there's 4 actually released, but in the beginning we have to use 2 of them. So when oxygen is lacking, certain organisms, we have like yeast, different types of cells can actually convert these pyruvate into other materials, which are going to help remove electrons and allow continuous ATP production. And it has to do with, again, remember, we need the NAD plus in glycolysis to make this happen. So in fermentation, you have this creation of the NAD plus, and that's pretty critical when we talk about why these are considered anaerobic versus aerobic. Without the oxygen, you're not going to have the natural cycle that's going to reproduce these. So in fermentation, you need the separate step that's going to regenerate that. And there are 2 specific types that we're going to look at. Alcoholic fermentation, and what happens there is you have your pyruvic acid, your pyruvate, and then you have the NADH. You're going to create alcohol, CO2, and this NAD plus, which again is going to go back then and recycle into glycolysis. Lactic acid fermentation is slightly different. Again, you have your same starting materials, but instead you're going to get lactic acid and the NAD plus. And we'll look a little bit more about these in the next slide. So the first one is alcoholic fermentation, and this is carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol production. For thousands of years, people have used alcohol fermentation for brewing beer, winemaking, and even baking. Yeast, remember back to the lab that you did in the previous week, is actually a type of fungi are used in the process, and the CO2 generated by fermentation causes bread to rise and different alcoholic beverages to be bubbly, while the ethyl alcohol, well, you know from there. However, the second one is this lactic acid fermentation, and this happens a lot in muscle cells. So when muscle cells are contracting too quickly, for instance, strenuous exercise, they rapidly use up the oxygen supply. So there's a normal amount of oxygen already in the cells, and when we decrease that or use up all of the oxygen supply, it is going to slow down ATP production. But again, when muscle cells need that energy, so there has to be this alternate pathway, and that's where lactic acid fermentation comes in. So muscle cells have the ability to produce a small amount of ATP through glycolysis in the absence of oxygen, which is how we get the lactic acid fermentation. And in here, the muscle cells are going to convert glucose to pyruvate, so that first step, glycolysis, and then they have a specific enzyme in the muscle cells that's going to help convert pyruvate into lactic acid, and also therefore releasing the 2 ATP molecules. Lactic acid is toxic and must be removed by the liver and thus converted back to the pyruvate. And heavy breathing after exercise helps restore oxygen back to muscle cells. So we just took a look at kind of the offshoot after glycolysis. So glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration, but the next pathways are determined whether or not we have oxygen. In the absence of oxygen, we are going to undergo fermentation, and there's 2 types: the alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So this gives you a brief idea of that piece of the pathway. In the next section, 9.2, we are going to look at the cellular respiration side. So in the presence of oxygen, for the aerobic respiration, you'll learn about next.